And welcome to another episode of The Focal Thought. My esteemed guest today is Terry Marks-Tarlow. How are you doing, Dr. Marks-Tarlow?
I'm doing very well, considering there is a fire very close to here, but it's blowing the other way. So I'm really happy to be with you.
I know that's that infamous West Coast fire, right? That's burning.
Exactly right. Yep, yep. Burning in Topanga right now, but I seem to be safe for the moment. And so happy to engage in conversation with you.
No, thanks for that. And I hope all will be well with the fire, of course.
Indeed.
I'm really excited to do this podcast with you today. Just a little bit of background for our listeners. So, you've got your BA in psychology from Stanford. You've got your Ph.D. in clinical psychology from UCLA. You have trained in cognitive behavioral work, as well as, Gestalt Therapy Institute. You've done some training there in Los Angeles. You've also done some hypnosis as well. And you've pursued analytic self-psychology. You've been studying interpersonal neurobiology and regulation theory. As well, if that wasn't enough on your palette, you're highly esteemed in movement work with dance and yoga as well.
Well, thank you very much. And I would add nonlinear dynamics is also important to this conversation, because that's really where the interest in fractals comes out of. So yeah, it's a pretty broad background, but I've been around for quite a while by this time. So I just keep learning and studying.
That's great. And just like the fractal patterns exhibit, so is your education and your learning. It's just going on and on into the bigger and better things.
As I think everybody should do, really, is to keep exploring new frontiers.
Yes, definitely. That's the only way we grow, right? Because if they say we're not growing if we're plateauing, we're actually going the other way, right?
Exactly. And it also helps keep us younger as we get older, too.
That's a good point.
Yep.
So just, some sort of background, if we look at, I've got the Wikipedia definition of fractals here. It says in mathematics, a fractal is a subset of Euclidean space with a fractal dimension that strictly exceeds its topological dimension. And simply put, a fractal is just a never-ending mathematical pattern, right? At the base of it.
Yes, a never-ending mathematical pattern that's recursive and is self-similar. So where the parts resemble the whole is an important part of it. So it's not just an infinite pattern. It's got a particular form to it. And the first part of the definition that you read about dimensionality put into regular language is really interesting, because fractals are not only the geometry of nature, which they are, which Mandelbrot, who discovered or invented them, knew right away. And that was the title of his original manifesto, which was in the 1970s. So this has only been around since the 1970s. But one of the things really interesting about the dimensionality piece is that they exist in between our regular dimensions, what we think of regular dimensions. So they occupy the space between ordinary dimensions.
These are the in-between quantum layers that you're speaking of?
No, not quantum layers, more like mathematical layers. So, for example, a point is zero-dimensional, and a line is one-dimensional, and a plane is two-dimensional, and a sphere, for example, is three-dimensional. And we tend to think in terms of, well, we live in a three-dimensional world, as if we're living inside those three dimensions. But really, everything that's interesting extends between those dimensions. So a fractal that is like a line that, like a scribble on a paper, for example, is a one-dimensional line that occupies two-dimensional space. And a mountainscape, for example, is a series of two-dimensional planes that occupies three-dimensional space. So it exists in between 2 and 3. And it's a difficult concept to wrap your head around when you don't think that way. But once you start sort of understanding and getting a feel for it, it's much easier to kind of follow.
Would it be then, if you're using your example of scribbling on the paper, would a fractal be in between the scribble and the paper?
Well, the fractal would be the scribble. So it's a line that's occupying, parts of it, and it's moving around, is going to be self-similar to itself. Or think of a Jackson Pollock painting where there are all those dots thrown on the canvas.
Yeah.
That also has a fractal dimension to it. And really interestingly, a physicist named Richard Taylor, who did the foreword to the fractal epistemology book, has used the concept of fractal dimensionality, not just the concept, but the measurement of it, to authenticate the Jackson Pollock pieces. So you can, it's going to be higher dimensional if it fits more of the plane. So a scribble that's a really tight one that goes all over the paper is going to have a higher dimensionality than just like a little ambling line. And, and so it's how much of the next dimension gets occupied. But another way of looking at that, which I just discovered yesterday from one of my authors who is an expert in fractal physiology, is that the topological dimension is the dimension of the pieces. So the scribble is made up of a bunch of lines, or one line really, because it's continuous. And the fractal dimension is the rule for combining the pieces. So that's another way of looking at it. So however you're making that scribble, whatever your hand is doing to make that scribble, that algorithm is the fractal dimension, or if that makes sense.
Got it. Okay, so it's the motion that you're making with your hand to make the scribble. That pattern is the fractal.
Right. Exactly.
Got it. Okay. And in my previous research on fractals, it's commonly seen as a sacred geometry, or we've all heard of the golden rule or Fibonacci sequence. So our listeners can get sort of an image of that when you see those beautiful mathematical patterns. And it's interesting to hear when you've spoken on other occasions that in nature, when we see, like you mentioned, mountainscapes or trees or forests, the pattern is in, right? Like the geometry, the algorithms are inherent in what we're seeing. So when we actually go to nature and we're feeling a sense of calm and peace, behind the mountain in terms of the image is actually this subset of geometry that's going on, right? That's what's actually giving us that peace.
That's right. And because perhaps our neurology also has a fractal structure to it, and the way our eyes move also, we're joining with nature when we're in nature and viewing it. And that may have something to do with why it's so calming, and not just calming, but healing as well. There's research by Richard Taylor, among others, that it can be very healing. Like if you are in the hospital, if you have a view of nature outside the window, or even a photograph of nature, is much better than if you're just staring at concrete walls in terms of healing. Sure.
And then what is it about the geometry itself that is giving us that peace? Because on a first layer, I would think it's the beautiful mountainscape, but really it's the algorithm of the math behind it. What is it about that? Is it something that resonates with us, or how does that work?
Yeah, this is up for grabs in terms of really understanding what it is that feels so spiritual about it. But what I would say is that we grew up, pretty much all of us have grown up with more traditional kinds of math that have, goes back to thousands of years. And we tend to think very linearly and reductively about math. So 1 and 1 makes 2, and you can break 2 up into 1 and 1, and the pieces combine to form the whole. But when it comes to fractal geometry, it's the opposite. The whole really determines the parts and constrains the parts. And so it's really holistic. It's much more holistic than we're used to thinking about things. And so there's a natural continuity with nature that comes out of that holism.
So it's almost like we're an extension of that geometry that keeps going on and on. It's, it's affected us in that manner, maybe, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So for example, one of the most basic fractal patterns in nature is a fractal branching pattern. So if you think about a tree and you've got a single trunk, and then let's say that trunk divides into 2 branches, and each of those branches divides, and each of those branches subdivides, etc. The basic shape is that V, and it's repeating over and over again. So you start with the whole, and then there's an emergence of the parts out of the whole. And you can think of that. People have thought about people that way when, for example, spiritually, you might say that we're all born with a soul, or we're all born with a kind of personality. And although our cells change and we grow and we learn and we develop, so differently from where we start out as infants, from a whole, we're still ourselves, moving forward. So the whole of ourselves is still helping us to craft the features and parts of development. And so reversing that and really having a holistic perspective is lovely, and it helps to heal a sort of fragmented world when we tend to think of things in pieces.
So really then by that regard, we're born sort of as the whole, and then, we grow up from an infant to an adult, older age person. But so it's sort of like almost the reverse happening, right?
Yeah, it's almost like the reverse happening, exactly, where we retain the whole of ourselves as we find the parts, instead of putting together the parts into a whole. So yeah, it is kind of like a reverse sequence from how we think. And a lot of the world's traditions do think in those terms, like the Buddhists we'll talk about starting out whole, and that wholeness is inside of us from the beginning, even though we may feel fragmented, or we may lose track of that feeling of wholeness. It's always there to touch bases, which is very different from Judeo-Christian type of religions that do tend to, start with original sin or what have you, or you have to reach wholeness after death. And it's a much more dualistic, divided kind of universe where God and creation are completely separate. So probably our religious orientation is part of what masked this fractal geometry and the understanding of it for centuries, including but another thing that really masked it is not having access to computers, because really it takes a computer to iterate the basic formula to really be able to visualize what that math looks like in its deepest form. So it wasn't, there's no coincidence that it wasn't until the 70s really that this became visible, because computers were really just coming into being at that time.
No, definitely. And, I would encourage our listeners, if they haven't done so, check out some of the fractal algorithms that are available online, like the Mandelbrot sequences, because you can have a 5-minute view of the algorithms that are permutating, and even some of the presentations that you've done, which was very surprising for me, because for myself, when I had sort of delved into some fractal images leisurely, it was limited to those computer designs. But then you've actually gone on to say that it's not only into those designs, it's into, our intuition, which can be fractal, maybe even our thinking. There's various patterns. It's in the animal kingdom in terms of the skin, of the animal, the patterns. Our fingerprints, have those patterns. You even went into one image of, epidemics, and how, there's a pattern of, fractal permutations happening there. So they're really everywhere, right?
Everywhere. And the patterns are not just patterns in space, but also patterns over time. So fluctuations in the stock market, or the frequency of earthquakes, or the distribution of wealth, or the distribution of the population, all of those have fractal distributions over time.
So then what we tend to think of as being random might not be so random then. Is there some sort of destiny going on?
Exactly. Because in nature, and this is one of the most interesting things I think about fractals, is that we may understand the patterning, the algorithm that gives rise to the pattern, but because there are elements of chance going on, we can't predict the pattern as it occurs in nature. Now, there is a kind of fractal that is perfectly linear in that it's predictable, and the small pieces look exactly like the large pieces, and but that actually doesn't occur in nature. That just occurs more on the computer and on for some of the mathematical structures that preceded the discovery of the Mandelbrot set. But in nature, it's only statistically self-similar. So it's like a snowflake, where different forces of nature are going to cause slight differences in how the fractal shows up. And so things that we thought were unpredictable or random or too complicated to be modeled, which in fact was a lot of nature, the complexity of nature, the way that the wind will bend trees and this sort of thing, we were unable to model until the discovery of fractal geometry. And now animators go crazy with it. So when you go to the movies and you see other worlds, or you see super realistic landscapes, those are probably using fractal algorithms.
Sure. And like you're saying, when it's someone like a computer doing it, or something rather, compared to when nature doing it, it seems that almost when nature's doing it, it's organically calibrating the math so that there is that perfection, right, in the permutations.
Yeah, there's a perfection in, I would say, in how the Buddhists think of perfect, and which I love as a clinician. I love this difference. So when we think of perfect in the Western world, we tend to think of perfect as like perfectionism, like I did it perfectly kind of thing. But the way the Buddhists think about perfection or perfect is perfect fit. And in that sense, absolutely, nature has everything is a perfect fit with everything else.
Got it. So our definition of perfect is much limited than nature's definition. Because I think I heard you say once, when you look at these patterns, it's instead of sort of these patterns being forced, they're almost combining, right?
They're not forced, but what they're doing is they're self-organizing.
Self-organizing.
They're self-organizing, and it turns out that all of nature really self-organizes. And what that means is that there's no, I'm sorry to say this, if you tend to think of, and the audience tends to think about God as, sort of directing the show, like figuring out, every move of every person type of thing. That would be a top-down controlling type of organization. But nature works from the bottom up and self-organizes from bases. So for example, the genetic code that each person has in our bodies doesn't specify what an ear is supposed to look like or what any organ is supposed to look like. It's really the interaction of the bases and the proteins and the cells that determine how everything shapes itself. And so it's a very different kind of a process of how order emerges from chaotic bases, often chaotic bases.
Got it. And then, thinking along those lines, they can probably be no God because God seems to be a fractal permutation that is always evolving, right?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think, to me, the one way, so people call the Mandelbrot set the actual visualization of the formula that Mandelbrot found, very different things, the warded snowflake or whatever, but some people call it the fingerprint of God. And you can really think of God in these terms. If you think of God as sort of the whole of everything out of which the parts emerge, then suddenly you can have a sort of a spiritual take on this aspect of math and physics, and which I definitely feel. I mean, there's, to me, a real spiritual feel. The more I understand about fractals, the more I get that feeling about them, and really had that feeling right from the beginning. When I just didn't understand why I had that feeling, and it's taken me decades to understand more about why.
No, it's very true. I fully agree with you because, even when I, read your work or listen to you on YouTube, I get that same feeling of peace and calm as if, if I've listened to something by a guru or, something spiritual. It's just, the geometry, brings about some sort of peace, because if you look at it, you get a clue as to what, God is, or, in quotas, or what nature is. It's sort of letting you have a peek as to what's going on. And you also mentioned, trying to be certain in an uncertain world. This
Right.
allows us to sort of be in between, right? Between
Everything. Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say, as you were talking, that a lot of the features of our everyday experience that are so disturbing to most people, like uncertainty or ambiguity or contradiction, are folded into these fractal shapes in many ways. And so there's a sense that it all fits together. And I happen to think that paradox is at the heart of the universe and at the heart of the psyche as well. And people when I do clinical work often struggle when they have mixed emotions or they have opposite impulses and this sort of thing. But how to get comfortable with all of that complexity and with all of that the ambiguity or things that can't be known or can't be figured out has certainly been a kind of a spiritual practice for me as a clinician, because it helps me stay calm when patients are not calm, or it helps me feel hopeful about the future, even though maybe the horizon is blocked at a certain point in time.
Sure. I think I also heard you say that, things are meant to be, right? Things, especially in times like these when we can't go outside, we have to go inside. And, it's comforting to know that if you don't have access to nature to see those beautiful landscapes to give you the peace, you can actually be at home and you can go inward, because that same geometry is inside the human body, right? You just have to know how to access it.
Exactly, the very same branching patterns that form the branches of trees are the patterns of the neurons in our brain and the patterns of circulation of blood and the lungs, the branches of the lungs, all of those are continuous in form with nature and meant to be, I would say, whatever, meant to be in the sense of it's what's happening. And so it's almost by definition meant to be because it's self-organizing in these patterns that, so I wonder, for example, when you mentioned the pandemic, and the pandemic does seem to be helping humanity reorient ourselves, both by, as you put it, going internal, being more willing and forced to be more internal on the one hand, but also reducing our carbon footprint on the other hand, and letting nature kind of rebalance to some degree. Now we may go right back to where we were, but I don't think so. I think work is changing. It's certainly changing in my field. My office building, which was almost 100% therapists, is almost vacant now because people are working from home more and working virtually a lot. And it seems that some kind of hybrid model will probably emerge out of this that allows, hopefully preserves some of the best of what has come through during this pandemic time. While allowing the flexibility and the freedom that we used to have to some degree, hopefully.
Sure. And, maybe the geometry at this time is taken on a different trajectory, right? And in its pattern, we're in the next phase of its pattern, maybe.
Hopefully so, because certainly we were headed, we are headed towards self-destruction if we don't turn things in the environment around, or if we don't deal with the racial justice issues that have been coming up, or with the discrepancy between rich and poor. And that's another place that the epistemology is very useful, is that it's all about the boundaries between things and how those boundaries tend to be porous and open and closed at the same time, depending on how the observer approaches those boundaries. But this helps, on the one hand, our culture has gotten more and more polarized between Democrats and Republicans, and rich and poor, and sexual orientation and this sort of thing. That in that area, it's been breaking down with the fluidity and gender fluidity. But the epistemology really shows us that these polarities are not inherent in nature. They're just created by humankind, and we can bridge those polarities and need to bridge those polarities if we're going to get more harmonious with nature.
Sure. I mean, people have a will of their own to, live on either seesaw of the polarity, but nature is both, right? It's both opposites at the same time.
That's right. It's both ends, all across the board. Yeah. And many indigenous cultures have recognized that, and but not so much our Western culture, because on the one hand, those polarities and classifications and pigeonholing of people and nature has helped us develop technology, which requires precision, not ambiguity. So it's allowed for all these advances. But on the other hand, we've regressed in terms of understanding the just giving people and their due respect, and not privileging ourselves apart from nature. We definitely have to join in again and now pay more attention to the continuity and not these polarities. not what's how we're distinct, and certainly we're not hierarchically on top. And it's easier to understand the problem with those kinds of hierarchies and patriarchies if we start with a more holistic perspective.
Sure. I know. I mean, ego is good for some self-confidence, but then again, taken to the extreme, it can take you away from deeper levels of understanding, right? I mean, I'm thinking of
Yes.
Karim, who's an architect from Egypt, who was building buildings, and then he actually got into biogeometry, which is what he coined it as, using sacred geometry in architecture. And he was saying that with buildings, the way we build them, is very rectangular, and it's not in accordance to the laws of the universe. And he was talking about buildings that are sort of built according to, like, say, the pyramids or the teepees that have that point on top. Those actually are much more energetically resonant with nature than a typical rectangular building.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting. There's a guy named Ron Eglash who studied how many African cultures build their buildings and the shapes of their communities using fractals. So there's a lovely book called African Fractals that shows how so many cultures there are using fractal algorithms. And of course, not consciously, they're not aware of the Mandelbrot set when they do it, but it's just emerging in their relationship to the land.
Correct. So there is more to it than meets the eye.
Right. Even though there's more to it than meets the eye. Exactly.
And I'm hoping our understanding and awareness of fractals, because right now it seems to be primarily with the eyes that we see it, but then we can also hear it through music, if you're using solfeggio or sacred music, as they say. Because if the overtones are in that sequence, our ear can, hear it. But hopefully it'll extend to our other senses, like the nose for smelling, or the taste with the tongue, or maybe even touching, right? Like,
yes, certainly the ears with music. Like I, for example, just before coming on with you was playing the piano, and ever since I was a little girl, I had been attracted to the music of Bach, and that's all I play these days are Bach fugues and preludes and inventions. And Bach is a particularly fractal composer, because the different voices, you can hear the self-similar themes in the different voices. And I've always been particularly attracted to that, of course, even before fractal geometry was discovered. So definitely with the ears, it's possible. With touch, I mean, what you're saying about the nose and with touch and taste and stuff, interesting. It's like an interesting thought. I haven't ever tried to think about how fractals might be there in smell, but in a way, isn't smell a kind of a fractal thing, in that if we smell something and then imagine the whole of it, we're using a tiny part where it's a sort of a self-similar experience, a cross-modal experience, but we're having a tiny sliver, just the way that I talk about intuition as having a tiny sliver of an experience of a person, for example, and having a sense of the whole. I guess smell does that too. So that is a sort of a fractally. I mean, we have to be careful about diluting the concept, too far, getting so metaphorical that we get inaccurate, but there's something to that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just brainstorming, but the possibility is there, right? You never know.
You never know, right? You never know. Dreams are particularly fractal, right? Where you have a we can have a dream and analyze it for years and get to the whole of who we are through a single dream image or even a snippet of a dream. So that has a very fractal feeling to it.
Yeah, I mean, one life is just not enough. We need many fractal lives.
Well, that whole idea of reincarnation is a fractal notion, isn't it? How our soul gets transported into a different life depending on how we've worked this one. That's certainly a fractal model of existence and continuity of existence.
No, that is true. That is very true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Listen, thank you very much for coming on the episode. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you, on this conversation. Because, you're someone that is not only, into the science of things, but you're also into the art of things. And it's very rare that, I get to meet someone who's, eloquently combined both of those facets in one, with your study with fractals and clinical psychology, as well as, with your movement and your dance and your yoga, and now today I found out about the piano. And, when you combine both of those, you're really sort of, mimicking nature, right? Taking two polar opposites and existing somewhere in the middle with them.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. And it is a particularly visual field, as you say. And the fact that I illustrate all my books as well is the other art piece to what I do. So I draw a lot of fractal drawings but try to illustrate these concepts myself. And if people are interested in these ideas, please come to my website, which is my name. It's www.Marks-Tarlow, my last name, MARKSTARLOW @Hotmail. And there are samples of my art. There are all my books that you can find links to, including this one. And you can also download my papers and chapters if you're interested in reading more about this stuff and getting a taste of how I write about it.
Yes, and I will be putting the website link in the show notes as well. And I want to highlight your book as well. I believe you're the author of 10 books, the most recent one, which is Fractal Epistemology, right? Came out last year.
Well, actually, the most recent book is called Mythic Imagination Today, the interpenetration of science and of mythology and science, the fractal epistemology. So I banged out 2 books right in a row.
Oh, nice.
But the epistemology is from 2020, and the soft cover did come out in 2021. So it is very recent. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Thank you very much. And I wish you well.
Thank you.